Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Sometimes new players get the idea that speed and maximizing little efficiencies are the most important things to focus on to improve. But as basic as it might sound, I think learning to make the correct decisions can be way more important than flawless execution when you're just starting out. One of the easiest ways to start improving if you're new is to learn which military units counter others. And that's what we'll look at in this video, including why some of the counters end up being so much better than you might initially think. For those of you who can consistently beat the moderate AI, you probably already know at least most of these, and you're more than welcome to share other ideas in the comments. I'll be sticking to the main 2 or 3 counters for each unit to keep things more simple, so keep in mind it's not an exhaustive list. As a side note, I'd also recommend to any of you that are newer players that you should try the Art of War tutorials as a good double check you picked up the basics. There's a mission dedicated just to picking counter units, which is a good test of whether or not you were paying attention. One last note before we start is I'm going to do the unique unit counters as their own video, since I think that's more advanced and less important to learn at first. I also realize this is probably coming 20 years too late for some of you, but still better late than never, right? Let's jump into it, starting with the archers. Now their most straightforward counter is the skirmisher. It might not be intuitive why someone throwing a spear is good against someone with a bow and arrow, but I like to think their tiny shields do a lot of work. They have unusually high armor against ranged units, and also have a secret attack bonus against archers in return, leading to really one-sided results, while also being the cheaper and faster unit to make. Another effective late game counter is the mangonel or onager. They're great because they damage a large area, and archers tend to bunch up and stand still while also having very low HP. I wouldn't say this is quite as effective of a counter in the mid-game, since the projectiles are slow enough that small groups of archers can dodge them if your opponent is paying attention. Another class of really important counters are the rams. Not necessarily to attack the archers directly, but simply because archers prefer to attack the closest target possible, and rams have incredibly high armor against ranged units. When placed in front of your other units, they end up soaking up the enemy archer's attacks and keep your unit safe behind. The next type we'll look at is the hand cannoneer. They're a version of archers more specialized to fight infantry, so the normal archer counters of skirmishers and onagers still tend to do quite well. Cavalry can be okay if hand cannoneers, or even archers for that matter, are in small numbers, but the main thing you don't want to use is infantry. That's generally true when you're up against archers as well. So if skirmishers are so good against archers, then how do you counter them? Well, like archers, they have low HP and tend to stand in one spot, so onagers are again a great counter. Cavalry is also quite good because skirmishers have minimum range, meaning they have to retreat from anything attacking them up close. You could argue that the militia swordsman line counters skirmishers, and they can certainly survive for a long time against them, but in both the early and late game, I think cavalry is the better choice if available. Speaking of which, the 2 most common types of cavalry to see are the scout line and the knight. So now let's take a look at those. Both of them share a weakness to spearmen and camels thanks to some hidden bonus damage, which is increased as those units are upgraded. The spearman line in particular is one of the hardest counters in the game, particularly because of how cheap spearmen are compared to cavalry. That said, when raiding, cavalry can sometimes use their speed to get away from spearmen, so defensively at least, having a few spearmen around your base is more useful than having a large group altogether. One way to address the cavalry speed advantage is, of course, to make camels instead. They're not quite as cost effective, but at least they can chase down cavalry and force a proper engagement. All that being said, there's one way that countering the scout line and the knight line differ massively, and that's in how they are against monks. Monks are a great counter to knights when they're in small numbers. Getting a conversion not only takes away one of your opponent's units, but also gives you a new one. So a single conversion can end up costing your opponent 2 units if you end up using it effectively. The knight will sometimes be able to take out the monk in time, but quite often it's better to run away, or even you'll see experienced players delete their knights rather than give them up. The scout and light cavalry line, on the other hand, has a hidden resistance to conversion, so it takes longer. Plus, they also have an attack bonus against monks. In fact, they might be the best counter to monks, and are commonly used on the map Arena, for example, to stop enemy monks from collecting relics. That's probably the most confusing counter when it comes to cavalry, and in other ways, knights and light cavalry tend to have very similar counters. Before we move on, I do want to point out a slightly more advanced case where archers can be a situational counter to cavalry as well. Unlike some other strategy games where cavalry is an amazing counter even against a much larger group of archers, that's not necessarily true in Age of Empires. If you can reach what's commonly referred to as a critical mass, where archers are able to take out cavalry in a few focused shots, they end up doing quite well with some micromanagement, whereas in small numbers, cavalry will consistently win out. Basically, I wouldn't say either universally counters the other. It really depends what the numbers are on both sides. But speaking of cavalry and archers, let's talk about their love child, the cavalry archer. Now they can be a very annoying raiding unit, no doubt, but they're also among the easiest units to counter on paper, since they take bonus damage from any anti-cavalry or anti-archer unit. Like any archer, skirmishers are a great counter because of their bonus damage and armor. Plus, again, mangonels and onagers are a solid choice, as they are against most ranged units. The Mongols are an exception there, but we'll save that for the unique unit list. Because cavalry archers are still classified as cavalry as well, pikemen also have bonus damage against them. Though in practice that one's a bit dodgy, and good luck actually landing many hits. Personally, I'm always excited to see pikemen when I'm raiding with cavalry archers, so I wouldn't rely on them solely. That said, camels are also a great counter because of their bonus damage, plus again their speed, so they can actually chase them down. So if camels are so universally good against cavalry while also being cavalry themselves, how do you counter those? Well, one small wrinkle is they actually resist anti-cavalry bonus damage. Spear units though still have some bonus damage, and it's enough that they're still quite good in the long run. Basically, anything except cavalry and siege should actually do okay. The trade-off camels have for their anti-cavalry bonus is they have relatively low HP, attack, and armor compared to knights, so it turns out that archers can be a decent counter as well, given you have enough of them. You don't see them very often, but I'd also put steppe lancers in a similar group. They don't hold up to arrows quite as well as the knight line, so a combination of pikes and archers tends to do the trick. Camels are also a good counter as well, like they are against basically any type of cavalry. The last type of cavalry is the elephant, and they are slightly different because of their high HP, which means archers have a hard time bringing them down. In that case, again, spear units are a great choice, and they even get more bonus damage than normal, but you could also consider using scorpions, onagers, or even monks to exploit their slow movement. It sometimes feels like there's a lot of weird exceptions when it comes to cavalry, but if you're in doubt, spears and camels are usually the main go-to units, and useful at any level of play. But that's enough about cavalry. Next, let's switch and check out infantry. The most common infantry to run into, I'd say, is one we've heard a lot about, and that's the spear line. Their popularity is twofold, partly because they counter cavalry so well, but also because their cheap cost makes them ubiquitous in the late game as a protection for siege. The thing about spearmen though is they only really do one thing well, and that's fighting cavalry. Basically everything else, whether it be skirmishers, archers, or swordsmen, will handle them pretty easily. Skirmishers and archers are helped out by bonus damage as well as being able to hit and run, while swordsmen just have much higher attack and win with raw stats. This is in fact the first time the swordsman line has come up as a counter unit, and in fact, besides halberdiers, I think there's only one other unit they counter well, and that's the Eagle Warrior. In fact, I'd argue they're the clear counter to Eagle Warriors, thanks to some very generous hidden bonus damage against them. Eagles have excellent armor against archers, and their own small bonus damage against cavalry, so swordsmen are my preferred counter. I can't think of a great real-world rationale for why a swordsman would be strong against an Eagle Warrior, and I remember this one being one of the least intuitive counters as I was learning the game. A side note here that's good to keep in mind is that actually many of the infantry unique units also have hidden attack bonuses against Eagle Warriors as well. So now let's talk about countering swordsmen. In that case, I think the best counter is the hand cannoneer. As I said already, hand cannons are a lot like archers, but more specialized toward infantry, doing 10 extra damage against them. Those are only available in the Imperial Age though, after researching chemistry. But before that, archers do a pretty good job. In Feudal Age, for example, archers are the main go-to counter against most things infantry, and swordsmen are no exception. In fact, one of the only ranged units that isn't great against swordsmen is the skirmisher, simply because it doesn't have the damage needed to deal with the infantry's armor and HP. So those are the counters to archers, cavalry, and infantry, but there's one more big category of unit, and that's siege. We'll start by looking at the ram. They have very high armor to ranged units, also called pierce armor, so infantry and cavalry are great choices against them. Rams in fact take 3 extra damage from any melee unit, so even villagers can work fairly well. You do want to be careful with villagers if there's other units around though, and only fight in an absolute emergency. The next one came up a lot when countering archers, and that's the mangonel and onager line. In that case, cavalry or fast-moving infantry like Eagle Warriors can be effective if they're unprotected. Again, you don't want to use anything ranged unless you're really good at controlling your units and dodging the incoming shots. Another really good counter is the Bombard Cannon thanks to its longer range, so in practice it can end up sniping onagers from safety. It's a similar set of counters to the Trebuchet. Basically anything fast or the Bombard Cannon are all great choices. Again, archers do very little damage because of the Trebuchet's armor against ranged attacks, while the Bombard Cannon is a bit unusual in that it does melee damage, in case you were wondering. A siege unit you don't see a ton, but sometimes will, is the Scorpion. They're reasonably good against archers and infantry, but I haven't listed them as a counter since they really need large numbers to be effective, and they're very hard countered by onagers. Cavalry can do alright as long as the Scorpions are in low numbers, but once they reach a critical mass, they can be very difficult to rush down. If you find yourself in that situation, onagers are really going to have a field day. To wrap up the siege units, when it comes to the Bombard Cannon, like most siege, it's relatively weak to cavalry, which can close the distance quickly. In fact, against Bombard Cannons, it's often more effective to deal with the units around it, since Bombard Cannons on their own are relatively easy to take down. The last type of unit we'll look at is the Monk. As I already said, light cavalry has both a resistance to conversion as well as an attack bonus against them. Archers can be a good choice, and Eagle Warriors also have some bonus resistance to conversions and some bonus damage of their own against monks, similar to light cavalry. Despite monks being slow and having low HP, in this case onagers aren't necessarily a good choice, since they can be converted if the monk player has redemption. In fact, I'd say converting onagers is the main use of that technology, and even more important than the ability to convert buildings. That said, fans of the Shalata Warrior will probably disagree with me on that. So those are all the basic types of land units and how to counter all of them. I realize that was a lot of information to throw at a new player, but if you can even remember one counter to each unit, it'll definitely help. Maybe unfortunately, another complicating factor to all of this is that armies tend to have more than just one unit. Often they're used as a combination, especially in team games. Age of Empires is a tough game to master because there are so many possibilities that can be going on, but that's also a lot of the fun. That's all for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.